Generations are defined by big moments. Everyone who's old enough remembers where he or she was when Pearl Harbor was attacked or when JFK was assassinated. And if you're 16 or so, you likely remember what it was like, how you reacted when you heard about the events of 9/11, that terrorists had hijacked 4 planes and flown 2 of them into the World Trade Center. For Joe Daniels, the president of the Ground Zero Memorial and the 9/11 Museum, the challenge is how best to represent that defining moment for an entire city, an entire nation.
Before Daniels got the job to build the 9/11 Memorial, he was a lawyer who worked right near Ground Zero. He was there the moment the first plane hit.
After seeing people jump and paper flying out, and that's when the South Tower was hit by United 175, saw this massive blast of flame and then just ran with everybody else.
You were right underneath.
Yeah. And it was a scary situation overall because it just felt like some general attack.
Surrounded by chaos and horror, Daniels made it back home safely. He says what he saw that morning and the days after changed his life.
I remember having to go past National Guard troops, having to show my ID just to get to my apartment. And, this is America. Like, we never had to do that. I mean, who would expect to see troops checking for ID, with machine guns? It really just changed things. But yeah, it's hard to communicate that to folks.
Just a few years later, the city made plans to build a memorial and a museum at Ground Zero. Having witnessed the destruction, Daniels wanted to be a part of the recreation. He left his job and signed on to work at the project.
I think in a job that you get to feel good about what you're doing and that you're going to make a contribution that lasts beyond.
There were a lot of fights over what the museum would be like. For instance, early on, there was talk of an International Freedom Center at Ground Zero. These plans were scuttled when victims' families complained that tributes to global human rights wouldn't be the proper sort of memorial for the dead. As the controversies mounted, Daniels rose quickly through the ranks.
I was the general counsel for the organization, and I got a call one afternoon on a Friday of Memorial Day in 2006 from somebody on the board of directors saying the founding president, she was stepping down, could you step in? And I said, sure. And it was sort of a battlefield promotion. Then Mayor Bloomberg became chair a couple months after that, and he interviewed me, and I went from acting president to permanent president.
You called it a battlefield promotion. This at times, this struggle to deal with all the entities and the competing forces must have felt like a real battle.
Yeah, it did, and it still does in a way. I mean, there's so many stakeholders that have legitimate things to say about this site. Of course, the family members, absolutely. Something like 40% of all the family members, 1,100 families, never got a stitch of remains back to bury. That's what this site is, and families do have a lot to say about this site. At the same time, people that live here, people that work here, the public entities, the political entities, there's all things to say about what has to happen. So our job at the memorial is to listen and to push forward and to get something done that we can all be proud of.
The memorial is now complete, but the museum will not open for another year.
Well, the design of the museum basically is essentially 70 feet below the street, where the very twin tower, the bedrock, it's just bedrock of where the tower stood. When visitors come down into the museum, they'll descend 70 feet to bedrock.
Once it's finished, it'll include exhibits from both the February 1993 and September 2001 attacks.
So in the museum, it's going to tackle some very difficult things. It's going to show what happened on that day, on 9/11. It's going to talk about what led up to what happened, and it's going to talk about living in a post-9/11 world.
And mixed in with the darker moments will be artifacts that represent strength and fortitude, such as one of the tower's slurry walls that holds back the Hudson River.
The archaeology of the space is concrete. That's what was here.
There's also a column that stood vertically from the bedrock to the roof of the South Tower.
There's the footprints that the actual exhibitions for the museum will go into, and they will sit right underneath both the north and the south pool. You can see that ramp up there. That is where visitors will descend down from the museum pavilion, stop at that overlook to see the last column, to see the slurry wall, and then they'll go into the main exhibitions underneath the 2 pools.
Then there's the survivor's staircase.
As things are collapsing, as people are running off, and the notion that it is now permanently saved and permanently in place, it's huge because it represents survival, and it's a recognizable artifact. It'll be the last thing that people pass as they come down to bedrock, as they come down from the Memorial Plaza. They'll pass the survivor staircase, and it says a lot about who we all are.
Everything about this seems to scream for raw. You want, almost as if you want to bring the terror, the fear, the noise of that day to the senses of the visitors.
That level of realness needs to be here in order to tell what actually happened. So this is not going to be a overly finished, overly fancy place. This is a place that is sacred.
Sacred because it's where remains of some of the victims of 9/11 are buried.
When people get to bedrock right here, they'll be standing in front of a wall behind which the unidentified remains of those that were not given back to family members will be brought in a very private space behind that wall.
I don't want any little piece of my son to be brought back down there.
Rosemary Kane is the mother of firefighter George Kane. Searchers didn't recover his remains until New Year's Eve of 2001. She's upset about the human remains display.
I waited months for him to be recovered. I don't want him put back down in that hellhole.
Kane is protesting the exhibit, along with other 9/11 family members like Maureen Santora, who lost her only son Christopher that day. He was a New York City firefighter.
It is incomprehensible to me to have to do this after almost 10 years.
Daniel says the space will honor the dead.
On that wall will be a huge quote that says, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time." And it's a message that each of the people that died that day are just like us, and they did what we do every day, which is simply to get up in the morning and go to work.
Another difficult and disturbing display in the museum will be a series of photographs and video of 9/11 victims who jumped from the towers to escape the flames and smoke.
That's a horrible thing that the terrorists forced people to make that choice. The conditions inside the buildings were so bad that they had to step out knowing that they were jumping to their death.
Making the decision to include these images was not easy.
The question of whether we show that in the museum, those issues are tough because they're so graphic, but at the same time, if you don't show it, you're not telling the full story of what happened.
When visitors return to ground level, they'll again see the calming sight of the memorial pools and a plaza filled with more than 400 trees.
Building this memorial in this setting hopefully restores, sort of closes up that wound a little bit and restores a sense of togetherness and in an ordered way. And I realize that, you know, people shouldn't forget what happened, but people should also remember that we did come together in the aftermath, and that when things like that happen, we have the capacity to do that.
When we return, we'll look at some of the artifacts of 9/11, so big that they need special housing, and others so small that many people walked right over them and didn't even notice.